The committee is today meeting in public session, and we have received apologies today from the chairman, Healy-Rae, and there's tributes been paid in the Dáil today to his late father, Jackie Healy-Rae, so he just couldn't be here. Senator Neale Richmond as well. Now, public mobile phone owners, I would like to remind members to ensure that the mobile phones are switched off. This is important as it causes serious problems for broadcasting, editorial and sound staff. Now, today we have a very interesting lineup. We have delighted to welcome Mr. Peter Rigney, Industrial Officer, and Gerard Gibbons, Social Policy and Legislative Officer from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, Mr. Pat Ivory, Director of EU and International Affairs, and Mr. Arnold Dillon, Head of Campaigns, both from IBEC, as well as Jim Miley, Director General, and Mr. Lewis Purser, Director, Irish University Association, IUA. Before we begin, I have to remind everyone of the rules on privilege. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make them identifiable. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Now, that's a standard statement. It doesn't imply that any of you gentlemen would make any comments because you're not in the position you are today if you're going around making allegations. Firstly, I'll ask the Congress IBEC, I'll first ask the Congress IBEC and then the Irish universities to make their opening statements, and I'm sure the committee members will have questions and comments. So I would prefer all the members to contribute first of all, our guests I should say, and then we'll be asking questions if required of members. So now I'll call on the Congress Trade Unions representative. Okay, thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to apologise for my colleague Gerard Gibbons, who's at the National Economic Dialogue today. Just to briefly address, in October 2017, Congress was asked to address this committee on the subject of Brexit and its implications. In my concluding remarks, I said, in the world after Brexit, Ireland's foreign policy in Europe will have undergone a reappraisal. Our traditional ally among the large countries will be gone, and the Franco-German axis will probably be revived. Where will Ireland sit in this new scheme of things? Where will our allies be? To misquote the 1916 proclamation, we might have to find new gallant allies in Europe. I hope to address these issues today, but first a brief word for the guidance of the committee about how we in trade unions structure our international work. Traditionally, the Congress of Trade Unions avoided international associations until we joined the EEC in 1973, where we joined the European Trade Union Confederation. The big players there are Germany's DGB, an informal alliance of the Scandinavian unions, and the Italian unions, where the three confederations representing Christian, communist and socialist tendencies work together. The French, with at least 5 major trade union centres, punch under their weight for that reason. Another big player is the British TUC. It's noticeable now in Brussels, when I go, that the influence of the British TUC is sort of ebbing away, even though they are members and still will be members. In a new development last September, the DGB, the German unions, hosted a meeting in Berlin on governance within the euro area. And I suppose this is an echo of an increased level of Franco-German debate on the Eurozone budget. But at that meeting, there was no TUC, there were no Scandinavian unions. So it was, I can't see that meeting having taken place before the Brexit debate took off. On the issue of alternative alliances, it seems that the issue has already been decided, at least according to the Financial Times and The Economist. We have joined what is termed the Hanseatic League, a loose alliance of the Netherlands, the Scandinavians and the Baltic states. Some of these countries, in turn, have more enduring alliances. Holland has worked in alliance with Belgium and Luxembourg since before the Treaty of Rome. It was the Benelux countries. While deep institutional ties exist between all the Scandinavian countries through the Nordic unions. According to the FT of November 7, 2017, while the countries, that's the Hanseatic League, are far from united on all EU policy issues, they share a common outlook on many economic questions, favouring dynamic competition on the single market and stressing the need for national budgetary responsibility within the Eurozone. Europe is a sort of a halfway house between domestic and foreign policy. On the foreign policy area, we have a radically different policy than in most other member states, such as on neutrality and to an extent on Palestine. However, internal EU matters are really just extensions of domestic matters and are handled by the line departments through the permanent representation in Brussels. We work with the ETUC on lobbying matters and through them in statutory committees on social dialogue, on migrant workers and on vocational training. This is one area where Brexit may cause significant change, I mean the social policy area. Up to now, when discussing a European proposal with Irish civil servants, we would often be told this proposal won't progress as the British will veto it. This response is now obsolete. A case in point is the process that preceded the adoption of the Information and Consultation Directive in the mid-90s, when Ireland and the UK argued for unanimity as opposed to qualified majority voting in order to attempt to veto the measure, an attempt which thankfully didn't prevail. Some of the alliances we make will be custom-built. An example is France, which traditionally has been our ally on the CAP, but far from our ally on the question of corporation tax. What relationships do we want with the Visegrad groups of Central European countries, given the number of our citizens who live in this country? This group has traditionally taken a very hostile attitude to progress in workers' conditions and labour law. A case in point is the recent spat between France and Germany on the one hand and the eastern countries on the other. France and Germany decided to apply their minimum wage laws to trucks passing through their territory, say from Hungary to Spain. The Commission launched infringement procedures against them, and bizarrely, in my view, Ireland joined with the eastern countries, Spain and Portugal, in supporting the Commission's action. How this builds our influence with France and Germany is beyond me. The decision-making process in Ireland to support this stance also remains a mystery, and this is an illustration of how a lot of stuff that happens in Europe is in fact not really foreign policy, it's domestic policy. But it could be foreign policy in that if we put a foot wrong on one issue, it could affect something else. In the century since the foundation of the state, Ireland's foreign policy has fallen into two phases. Up to the 1950s, it was all about regulating our relationship with Britain and protesting about partition. This reached its high point in February 1949 when Seán McBride offered to abandon neutrality and join NATO in exchange for an end to partition. From the late 50s, the emphasis moved towards Europe in tandem with Britain's move in the same direction. We are now heading into a third phase at a time of increasing uncertainty in world politics. And just as a focal square, I noticed today that the latest utterance from Boris Johnson is that the appliance of tariffs, external tariffs by the EU would be the equivalent of the continental blockade of the Napoleonic Wars. So on that happy note, I will leave you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'll call on our next speaker, Ibec.
Thank you, Chairman. Firstly, I would like to thank you for another opportunity to set out the views and concerns of business to your joint Oireachtas committee as you undertake your work on considering alliance building within the European Union. As you know, IBEC is the country's largest business organisation, representing our members at national, European and international level. Over recent years, we've been working intensely at national and European level to support companies as they manage the ongoing uncertainty of Brexit disruption. Most recently, we have also been working to highlight business priorities during the European elections for the European Parliament, and subsequently as the focus turns to the election of the new presidents of the European Council and Commission and the appointment of the new College of Commissioners. Brexit, unsurprisingly, remains a top concern. The failure of the UK Government to ratify the withdrawal agreement has left business with the complex task and enormous cost of managing the uncertainty of moving Brexit deadlines. Millions of euros have already been spent putting in place and in many cases activating costly contingency plans. The divisive and ongoing polarisation of the UK political debate has increased the likelihood of a no-deal outcome, driving up the cost of contingency planning further. For the record, business fully supports the terms of the withdrawal agreement. which comprehensively address the key challenges that arise in the exit process. From the perspective of business, customs and regulatory alignment across the island of Ireland is vital to avoid the return of a hard border, safeguard the all-island economy and protect the Good Friday Agreement. The unique challenges facing Ireland and Irish business in the Brexit process has meant we have invested enormous energy in strengthening our links and cooperation with other EU and international business groups over recent years. It is vital that our partners in Europe fully understand the specific economic and political challenges that Brexit presents Irish business and supports an outcome that comprehensively addresses them. IBEC has had a permanent office and staff in Brussels since the 1970s, and the organisation is a member of Business Europe, the leading advocate for growth and competitiveness at EU level. This group brings together business federations from 35 countries, and IBEC actively participates on its Council of Presidents, its Executive Committee, and its numerous policy committees and working groups. We are also the Irish members of business at the OECD based in Paris and the International Employer Organisation based in Geneva. In addition to these horizontal type business organisations, IBEC's numerous trade associations are affiliated to their different sector associations at EU level. An audit of our activities shows that over 60 of our staff are involved in approximately 200 committees and working groups in over 65 different organisations. So this is an enormous commitment of time, effort and finance to building alliances right across Europe. Given the challenges on the horizon, we have stepped up our engagement with strategic business partners significantly over recent years. We have travelled across Europe to meet with our business partners in their cities, including Berlin, Paris, The Hague, Vienna, Prague, Copenhagen, Tallinn and Helsinki and Athens, and other places where Ireland does business. Indeed, the breadth and depth of our ongoing work makes us among the top business federation lobbyists at EU level, alongside the key German business groups. All of this means that IBEC has a truly unique capacity to ensure Irish concerns are understood and also to shape common EU-wide positions. This has been the case when it comes to Brexit, with IBEC ensuring that Irish concerns are reflected clearly and strongly in EU-wide business positions. But it is an issue that goes far beyond Brexit. IBEC has set out in detail our priorities for the future of Europe and the direction of the post-Brexit EU, and of course an EU without the UK will be very different. Ireland and other remaining EU member states must seize the opportunity to invigorate their commitment to a stronger, more prosperous EU, which further develops the single market, the digital economy, international trade, and enshrines pro-jobs, pro-growth conditions and a real commitment to innovation at the very heart of EU decision-making. We are working with our partners across Europe to make that happen. And our work also focuses on global issues and connections that are so important in an open, globalised economy like Ireland. In recent years, IBEC delegations have visited Washington, DC, New York and elsewhere to strengthen our engagement with US business and our representative organisations such as the US Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers and the US Council of International Business. We have also welcomed leaders from these organisations to Dublin to meet with Irish business leaders. This is a key part of investment and trade in Ireland, is this strong relationship between not only Ireland and the United States, but also the EU and the United States. And this is something which we continue to be committed to, even in a challenging global environment. In conclusion, Key international challenges have intensified the work of IBIC in forging strong alliances with our partners in Europe and further afield. This is work we carry out typically in close cooperation with government and our international embassy network across the world, which is second to none. And of course, there is more to do, and we intend to further strengthen our engagement with like-minded EU and international business groups as we face the challenges ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ivory. I call now on the Universities, Irish Universities Association, IUED, to make their contribution.
Thank you, Chairman. Deputies, Senators, thank you for the opportunity. We've submitted our opening statement, and I just propose to touch on some of the points from that rather than going through it in full detail. There's a broad range of alliances across the EU that Irish universities are involved in, and I suppose the best known are through the Erasmus Plus programme and the Horizon programme on the research side, and I want to reflect some points on both of those, as well as speaking obviously about the post-Brexit scenario and the broader alliance building that's undertaken across Europe. To start with Erasmus, as you're aware, the Erasmus programme has now been running since 1987, and some, close to 500,000 students have crossed borders across Europe to participate in the Erasmus programme over those years. In the Irish context, there are about 90,000 students and staff who have travelled to one of 32 countries during that time. And over the same period, around about 115,000 learners have likewise come to Ireland, cementing Ireland's reputation as a high-quality study destination, as well as laying key foundations in forging working relationship with future leaders. As I'm sure you're aware, there are many prominent political leaders across Europe who were Erasmus programme participants in Ireland in the past. The overall impact of international students in Ireland is worth noting. Recently, we published an independent report by Durkan Economic Consultants, a copy of which has been sent to all members of the Oireachtas. And in that report, Durkan shows that international students, that includes Erasmus, but also other international students, are worth an aggregate €387 million a year in export earnings to the Irish economy. So it's become a very significant economic driver for the economy, apart from the intrinsic educational value, obviously, that comes from that. I think it's worth noting also that 40% or more of Erasmus trainees are offered a position by the company that they train with, and that's a European Commission data. And in addition, the unemployment rate for Erasmus graduates is 23% lower than for their non-mobile peers. So I think the value of international travel, both in and out, is unquestionable. A couple of points, I suppose, in terms of the current and future issues. The outgoing European Parliament have confirmed that funds for the next Erasmus programme should be tripled to allow more young people take part in different learning mobility schemes. Now, obviously, that is subject to the next Parliament agreeing the fine print of that, but I think it is an indication of the ambition for the programme. And I think for us, the emphasis here is not just about the numbers who travel, it's also about who travels. And in particular, there is and there will be an emphasis in the next programme on broadening access to the Erasmus programme. A huge amount of effort has been, and a success indeed has been generated in Irish universities in broadening access across social strata. So currently in Irish universities, 1 out of 4 new entrants are coming in through dedicated special access programmes, either the Here and There schemes that target socio-economic disadvantage or disability, and also other special access programmes. But those students are underrepresented when it comes to participation in the International Erasmus programme, and we would propose that government prioritises and incentivises that so that more of those access students can participate in and avail of Erasmus programmes. I think it's worth noting that, and indeed the Minister of State for Higher Education, Mary Mitchell-O'Connor, who recently launched the Enhancing Mobility for Access Students in Ireland, called for national targets to be introduced for the mobility of non-traditional students, such as mature students, students with disabilities and so on, and we would strongly support that. We'd also reference the recent our Charter for Irish Universities that we launched last year, and in that charter the 7 universities that the IUA represents have committed themselves to enabling 20% of students to undertake a study or placement abroad, and that would be a significant increase from what we currently have, and also to increasing international inward students to 15% of the total student population. So I think the successes of Erasmus and the benefits both to the economy and to the students themselves, as I said earlier, are well recognised, and we now should really focus on expanding that. To move to the research and innovation, or the Horizon agenda, as you're probably aware, the first Horizon programme, which ran from, or FP7, which ran from 2007 to 2013, the Irish drawdown from that was 625 million. The current programme, which runs out next year, there's a target for a 1.2 billion euro drawdown, and currently that our current drawdown is just over 700 million. So there is very much an upward trend there. And of that drawdown of 700 million, the 7 universities that we represent have drawn down 55% of it. But I thought the crucial emphasis needs to be on the next programme, the Horizon Europe 2021 to 2027, which we think will present significant opportunities to Ireland, both to industry and to the third level sector. But we'd like to emphasise that our capacity to draw down more EU funding can only be achieved if we provide more funding from domestic budgets. So we're asking in our budget submission this year for an additional 50 million per year of domestic money to be specifically targeted for investigator-led research, because we have a number of our best scientists at the moment who are not getting any Irish government funding, and therefore they are inhibited in their capacity to draw down EU funding, because if you don't have other sources of funding, you can't qualify for the EU Horizon funding. So we think that's a particular important priority for the Irish economy in terms of building our innovation capacity for the future. A few brief comments on Brexit. Obviously, as other speakers have outlined, there are challenges and there are opportunities. The third level sector is no different. We have a long-standing and very positive relationship between Irish and UK universities. They're our biggest partner, as one would expect, as our closest neighbour. There are also of the order of just short of 10,000 Irish students currently studying in the UK. Now, thanks to both Irish and British governments, their terms and conditions, if you like, in terms of their fees, have been guaranteed in the short to medium term. But as we take that forward, there is a real opportunity, but also potentially a substantial risk, depending on the outcome of Brexit, if the fee structure were substantially changed on either side in relation to that relationship. And to put 10,000 students in context, that's, as Deputy Durkan would know, that's close to being a Maynooth university or thereabouts. So if the Irish education, third level system, which is already under pressure, had to absorb even a portion of those, it would place an intolerable strain on the system here. So I think our emphasis in this post-Brexit scenario is strengthening our existing ties with other European partners, but continuing to manage the relationship with our closest neighbour, because regardless of Brexit, we need to maintain that, and that's hugely important in terms of the future for our system. Finally, just in terms of broader alliance building, notable that just this morning the results of the European Universities initiative were announced just a couple of hours ago. This, as you'll recall, is the President Macron-inspired initiative that sought to build formal alliances of universities across borders. 20 or so consortia were announced as successful bidders for those, and amongst those, pleased to inform you that 2 Irish universities, 2 members of ours, Dublin City University and Trinity College Dublin, have been successful with their alliances in winning funding under that programme. There's approximately €5 to €6 million being provided for each alliance as part of a pilot phase of this programme, but it's successful. And again, this links back to the future of both the Horizon and the Erasmus programmes. This is specifically under the Erasmus programme. If successful, it would be intended that these alliances would be strengthened, but also that there would be more alliances built in the future. So I think it's a significant achievement that 2 Irish universities are in that first phase. So I suppose to bring it together in regard to higher education, in terms of research and innovation, these are areas where Ireland could take a lead on cooperating at a European level. Alliance building isn't just limited to governments or parliamentary relationships. As I've shown, universities have a pivotal role to play here. However, if we are to effectively engage with European partners in order to realise our ambitions, the gap in state funding for higher education must be addressed. State funding, direct state grants per student to Irish third level, not just universities but across the system, has fallen from around about 9,000 per student to just over 5,000 per student in the last decade. So we need an investment programme to begin to close that gap and to ensure that the system here is in a position to avail of the alliance opportunities that will arise in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melly. Just before I ask the members here, just say that to commend indeed the work that the Congress of Trade Unions and IBEC and indeed your own organisation, Mr. Miley, are doing, and they working together with our permanent staff in Brussels is absolutely vital. I mean, it is a major change, but the influence of the unions, the business representatives, universities working together as on behalf of Ireland incorporated. And I think that there's generally very good cooperation from the permanent representatives in Brussels in relation to your work. And I know the work of both your organisations over in Brussels. And it's very important. We're just back, our delegation here are just back from COSAC, which met in Romania there. And even yesterday, just to bring you up to speed in relation to the Erasmus programme, there was kind of an amendment proposal that future expansion, and many of our members here are very keen that not just university graduates, and my daughter availed of Erasmus like so many. It's one of the best programmes actually with that common agriculture policy. I think it embraces all the 28 countries, and I hope that Britain, I think, they're going to remain in that programme and pay that programme for the short-term future. But just say that in the expansion to allow apprentices to go from here and there to learn the new technologies in relation to energy, wind energy, solar panels, all that thing. So yesterday there was an amendment down that, in fact, that the governments themselves would be responsible for the expansion of Erasmus. But we didn't agree with that. And we went back, my colleagues here, we went back and said, look, the Erasmus programme is a European Union programme, and it must continue to be a European Union programme, funded to the extent. And I think since 1987, you said there are 500,000 people. It's enormous, the amount of people. I was on the plane yesterday, I spoke to a young doctor who had studied in Italy, actually, Bari. And, you know, this exchange of people coming and going, and there have been so many unions formed, permanent unions formed, and families formed from the Erasmus program. It's quite, somebody said to me, it would be worth a research of somebody, maybe you've carried out research already in relation to the Erasmus programme, but the in-depth research of the effect it had on the whole of Europe I think nothing has brought Europe closer. And it's regrettable in a sense that those students probably that studied from the United Kingdom didn't have the influence to change the people's mind in relation to Brexit. Because I think if they had a vote, I'd say they had certainly a vote to remain. That being said, I just thank you for your efforts and your contribution here is very worthwhile, in fact, in relation to building up links between organisations throughout Europe. And I must say from my own experience being in the Council of Ministers, that Irish representatives, and I've said this, all organisations and governments have enormous influence above our weight in the European Union because of our style of contacts and relationships that built up, and long that may continue. And we will miss the United Kingdom there because they were our allies. Now, any of our members here, Deputy Durkan, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. And I want to welcome our guests and to congratulate them and thank them for the work, the constructive work that they have done in their respective capacities over the years and meeting the challenges of the modern Europe in the way that they did in the past. We all contributed to that debate. We all hope it will be successful. It's not going to be easy, and yes, there are new challenges, there are new opportunities, but we must presume to take full advantage of every opportunity that comes our way, because there may not be an opportunity to go back and revisit again. As the Chairman has already said, we have just come back from the Congress of the European Affairs Committees of the European Union in Bucharest, and it's ironic in actual fact the debates, you could have anticipated the debate there, because there was quite a long debate on maximisation of employment and employment opportunities and investment opportunities through the medium of education and technology. Very interesting debate which went on for quite a long time, and is something that obviously the members here and my colleague here has taken particular interest in. I think that it goes without saying that as every day passes, there are new opportunities arising and emerging through education and through technology. And I think that to be able to focus on those areas, to zoom in on those areas and avail of them will create the future that we need, that of further opportunities for an expanding population, because we live in a different world to what we did 20 years ago. The people of Europe now are a moving population. They go to where the jobs are, whatever those jobs might be. I think that's a very good thing from our point of view, because we over generations in this country went to where the jobs were as well. That happened to be abroad, in the United States, in the UK, across Europe, across the globe, New Zealand, Australia and so on. I think it's a really great thing that we have eventually arrived at a situation where people want to come here and make a contribution to our economy and use their skills and the technology to assist us in our quest for increased employment. I'm not going to go on very long, other than two things. The alliances that you've been referring to, I think they're hugely important. And I think corporate alliances are also important, that have to be made to the benefit of one or either side in the course of what's happening in the future. We must remember this, that emerging across Europe at the moment are diverse opinions as to what democracy is about, what cooperation is about, and where we're likely to go in the next 50 or 60 years. And I think the best thing we can do is look back on the last 50 or 60 years and look at the progress that was made from Europe when it was in its ashes to when it was built up to be a really strong entity, a uniform entity. And I'm thinking back to the time that we, as in the per capita GDP in this country, the per capita income in this country, was a fraction of what prevailed in other European countries and obviously the United States, to a position where we are on par with most at the present time. Even in the depths of the recession, we still maintained we were keeping in touch all the time. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that, and I think we have progressed a great deal. I think there are challenges now, and the ones that worry me most, and I haven't spoken about this before. I believe that a certain amount of damage has been done to the cohesiveness of the markets all over Europe already. And I think that can be seen by looking at the UK car industry, for example. which is down, and then the announcements on a daily basis. See, we seem to take these as read that they were inevitable, and they were inevitable. But they're happening, and they didn't happen after Brexit. They have happened in anticipation of Brexit. And what would worry me most about that is that why the modern architects of the new Europe, and particularly the architects of Brexit, didn't foresee these issues beforehand. Nigel Farage spent 20 years undermining the European Union in order to come to a stage of achievement. When it was over, he had achieved the result, he disappeared into the background because he had nothing more to say. Now he wants to come forward again, obviously, to do something else. But worse still, Mr. Chairman, a large portion of our colleagues across in the UK didn't seem to have knowledge of what Plan B was. When exiting the European Union was one thing, allegedly to gain freedom from whatever, I'm not too certain. But the point about it is this, is that the damage has been done to a fairly considerable extent, and this is happening across Europe. I hope that we're not heading back to an earlier era where nationalism, ultranationalism begins to re-emerge. It would be a disaster if that were to happen. Last point I want to make is in relation to in the last couple of days we had several exchanges with our colleagues around Europe and also with our colleagues from the UK who are still at the meeting at this stage. They didn't expect to be there, and nice guys, made very valid submissions and so on, and at the same time are pleading their case. And the point that comes to mind is this. Remembering that there was no Plan B, and now we're being told, well, it's going to be all right on the day. It's going to be perfect. You'll get everything you want. You no need to have any worries at all about it. Since there was no Plan B, Chairman, I doubt if there's a Plan C or D either. And it would worry me most that we could have a serious consequence. And let's not forget this. The Good Friday Agreement, very important element of Anglo-Irish relations over the past number of years. Following a 30-year guerrilla war, during which the most atrocious events took place on the island of Ireland. And it would appear to be at risk now. And the question that comes to my mind is, what value an agreement? What value of a modern agreement if everybody doesn't stand over thereafter? Particularly in an emotive one of that nature. Because we have heard people, and we've all heard people say in the last few weeks, you know, what is the problem with the Irish border? There are borders all over the world. Yeah, there are. But there are a few borders all over the world, like in the Balkans and a few other places, where people are very careful not to offend the dignities of the people within those particular areas, and for a very good reason. And I would say in this, that the Irish position has been held, I think, very well so far, and supported very well by European colleagues. And I think we should recognise and owe that to them. But it is also in the interests of Europe itself. This is not just about Ireland. This is about Europe itself. Will Europe prevail? Will the Europe that we have begun to recognise and to live at peace in the last number of years, will it prevail? Or will it be undermined? Will the Good Friday Agreement prevail? Well, you know, some of the things that have been said certainly will undermine it to a huge extent. And there are people who say, well, we cannot change our views. You're going to have to change yours. Well, that's the oldest negotiating trick in the book, Chairman. We are not the ones who opted to leave. We didn't ask to leave. And we believe we have a contribution to make, and we are making a contribution, small countries as all. And the last point is in relation to all the small countries. I've said this many times, you'll be bored with this, Chairman. I believe strongly that each country in Europe has a contribution to make, whether it be large or small, on the European platform. And it depends on what we bring to the table. We can bring positivity or negativity, and each will have their consequences. But the important factor is this, that there's a slogan in Europe, you know, bringing Europe closer to the people. I think we have to bring the people closer to Europe, which is a different story altogether, and maximise the extent to which all European people across all nations, big and small, recognise that they are Europeans and that they want to make a contribution to that ideal. Thank you, Chairman.
call on Senator Gerard Craughwell, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. If you don't mind, I'll address each group individually, and I'll start with Mr. Rigney from ICTU. You're very welcome indeed, Mr. Rigney, today, so you are always good to meet somebody from ICTU who's looking after the workers of this country. One thing I had to challenge, I do it every time I hear the word neutrality, I challenge it. Ireland is not a neutral country, never has been, never probably will be. If we were to be truly neutral, we certainly wouldn't be having our defence forces denied a pay rise over the last 6 weeks and denied any notion of what's going on in the Public Service Pay Commission. On the pay side of the workforce in Ireland, Mr. Rigney, I've had a number of discussions with people from both ends of what I call the economy. There is a real risk, and I believe, and I'd welcome your views on this, the high-tech industry that there is in Ireland is slowly pricing itself out of the European market. When you find the likes of the big IT companies having to pay salaries in excess of €100,000 in order to attract in the competencies they need to run their organisations, and then furthermore having to spend money on accommodation for those employees. I'm talking about their home accommodation, so they're buying apartment blocks or the like. It is the view of senior people in that industry that I've had conversations with that it is only a matter of time before these countries will exit Ireland. They are footloose companies. They have very little investment by way of hard capital in the country. Intellectual capital they have plenty of, but intellectual capital, as we know, is highly mobile and may move at any stage. 40% of the world's soft balance sheets are in Dublin. That, I think, is something IBEC may be able to confirm a little bit later on. 40%, all we need is one serious shock to any one of those companies, and those companies could move as fast as they came. I think the only one in the IT industry that's likely to be stuck here is Intel, because they have serious capital on the ground, if you want. So I'd be interested in your views on that. I'm also interested in your views on how the labour market, the costs of labour, at that end we know. At the other end, today we have hundreds of workers outside hospitals all over the country. And is it the case that there is now becoming a them and us within the labour market? And if there is, I'd be interested, Mr. Rigney, in any recommendations you might bring in light of our future in Europe. That's my key thing. We're going to have enough on our plates besides dividing the workforce. So I'd be interested in your views on that. If I may move on to Mr. Ivory. Mr. Ivory, your colleague and yourself, Mr. Dillon, it's good to meet you again, and we're meeting on the same subject, so you'll forgive me if some of my questions are in the same area, but I think it's important we put them on the record in this committee. The issue of the border. The day before, I addressed the COSAC meeting in Bucharest on the Brexit issue. And in that, I laid out a number of priorities. And the first priority I laid out was that the single market cannot be compromised under any circumstances. So if you take it from a European perspective, the single market is the first priority for all of us. After that, then you're into such things as the Good Friday Agreement, and all that comes with it cannot be compromised. The movement of people across the border cannot be compromised. We could go on with a number of other issues that can't be compromised, and the difficulties we have in shared responsibility for national infrastructure, where some institutions are north of the border and some are south of the border. I am deeply concerned that government to date have not set out their solution to the border problem in the event of a no-deal scenario. I'd be interested to know what IBEC's position on that is. Last time we met, Mr. Ivory, we spoke about the stop-start efforts that are going on in Brexit. And I think Mr. Dillon, if I'm not mistaken, outlined the costs to industry with respect to inventory building in order to prepare for a shock exit, then being told, sorry, we have an extension, so there's no need to keep that inventory, we can now let that go. And I think, Mr. Dillon, if I'm not mistaken, you were speaking about the cost of borrowed money to fund that inventory, which ultimately becomes a cost on the business. There is some suggestion at COSAC and various other places in side discussions that we might consider giving another extension to the UK. When I say we, I'm talking about the wider European movement. Give another extension to the UK in order to allow them to get their house in order. If I'm not mistaken, the impact of what you said at the last time we met would be that that would be a serious cost, and this is something that can't be allowed to continue. Stop, start, stop, start. People in business need to know where they are, and they need to build their solutions around that. So I'd be interested in that. Two further points for yourself, Mr. Ivory. One is the issue of, have we quantified the number of companies in Ireland that could accommodate direct sea access from Ireland for the supply of goods or for the delivery of goods into the wider European market? We're told that we can expect 9-kilometre tailbacks of trucks at our ports. If it's possible to get non-perishables across the sea bridge, have we looked at the cost of that, and is it prohibitively expensive, or is it something that can be built into it? And the last one, a lot of what you had to say related to the United States and our relationships with various companies in the United States. I wonder why we're not looking east. Right now, the Iranians would welcome an Irish embassy being opened, and we would have 80 million people to service and a wider community of 400 million people that could be serviced through Iran. And yet we will not open an embassy there. So I just wonder why we're not doing that, if IBEC have an opinion on it. With respect to the third level sector, Mr. Miley, thank you very much for coming in. I think this is the first time we met at this committee. There was indeed a discussion at COSAC, and the discussion was education driving the single market. And I was particularly interested by the presentation that was made by the president of one of the universities in Bucharest with respect to a number of issues that he saw as critical going forward. We're tending to talk about an information economy now, an economy that would be driven by IT and IT solutions. I would have some reservations about us over-concentrating on that. I'd like to see some equal concentration in the area of apprenticeship and the like, and you may address that yourself, Mr. Rigney, if you want at the time. But one of the things that is limiting the ability for cooperation throughout Europe is the non-recognition of qualifications on a standard basis, if you follow my drift. A BSc should have the same value regardless of where that BSc is acquired. Again, there was some discussion about the issue of microcredits and how microcredits may be used in lifelong learning to allow people to build a credible set of qualifications to allow mobility within the workforce, or to allow the reskilling or upskilling of those who are in redundant professions or professions that will soon be redundant to move on and to become active citizens in the new emerging economies. So that might be one. The progression issue, which again sort of lies around the area of microcredits and recognition of prior learning. One of the things I cannot and never could understand is that Irish students going through the further education sector can transfer to English universities, getting full recognition for their 2 years at a diploma course. Yet in Ireland, they cannot do that. In many cases, the national universities will not accept them other than to accept them as a Leaving Cert student through the CAO system. And I think that is limiting our ability to allow for upskilling, or to allow those who are second chance learners, like I was myself, to move from one sector to another. I had to move to an English university to take a qualification. I couldn't do it directly from an Irish one. So that bothers me, if you want. Now, my colleague spoke about funding, my colleague, the chair, spoke about funding with respect to Erasmus and Erasmus Plus, and there is definitely, with a tightening European market or budget, there is definitely an effort to try and make local governments fund more of the Erasmus programmes in order that we don't disenfranchise the students who would avail of it. There's limited money in Europe, so let's get the national governments to pay. To my mind, that would be a retrograde step, and I'd be interested in anything you have to say on it. With respect to funding, again, of universities, I adverted to the fact a little while ago 40% of the world's soft balance sheets are in Dublin. And yet, I'm not sure that there is any PhD programme going in the country specifically in the area of cyber security. There is no umbrella body dealing with cyber security in the country. We are very fortunate in the companies we have invested heavily in their own cyber security, but the state has not taken responsibility for cyber security per se. I'm just wondering, from the university's point of view, is there a case to be made for, under, say, the Department of the Taoiseach, for a cyber security organisation to be set up that would provide a significant amount of funding, not just for Irish students in Irish universities, but for Irish students in collaborative programmes right across Europe. Because remember, where cyber security is concerned, we're always 2 steps behind the criminals that are driving it. So I'm really concerned about the, I suppose, weakness I see in the economy should there be a significant attack at some stage in the future. So I leave it at that. I appreciate there are a lot of questions there. I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chairman.
There may be a lot of questions, but a lot of them might be beyond the possibilities of answers, so I don't, it's a matter for the members themselves that can respond, and it is an open discussion in a sense. I'm not going to inhibit anyone, but just say before you reply, just say, how do you find the moment, all the organisations like IBEC and the Congress Trade Unions and the universities, in relation to funding limitations, in relation to the additional work, because of Brexit, you're required to far more lobbying than you were doing. So are your members aware of the need for extra funding for your organisations to allow you to carry out your work in a sense? And do you find as well there's an understanding among your colleagues in the other 26 countries that Ireland is in a uniquely difficult position in relation to the fact that we had free trade with the United Kingdom since 1963, since the mid-60s, when the Mass and Wilson were there. And then we had under the European Union, the Single European Act and so on and so on. Then all of a sudden, complete change in that. So are they aware, now most of our colleagues that we meet at COSEC are aware of our situation, but they're also aware that they have difficulties too. As the Estonian Prime Minister said to me, you know, we have 70,000 workers in London, and where are they going? At least you've got free access and your free movement. That's negotiated, which is a great success. And you also mentioned there, we will continue to build up our relationships with the United Kingdom industry and employers and employees and TUC and everything else. That will continue. There'll be a new arrangement, but we will be there. We have to be there because they're our biggest customers and they're nearest neighbours. So that being said, I always say, whatever else to respond, you decide yourselves who responds. I don't think you have to give a complete response to everything that's been said. It's more of a discussion than anything else. Some is beyond your capacity. It's a question of we open embassies. Where we do is not responsibility, it's a matter for foreign affairs. That's outside the European Union, but that's neither here nor there. I'll ask each one of you to respond in any way you feel appropriate. So, you start up, yes.
Sir, Jim. In relation to the questions that were asked that were germane, I think I'd first like to state that we operate in Northern Ireland also, so we have another perspective. Like there's an awful lot of uncertainty there, particularly in places like food co-ops where there is no pool across the border. There is a common milk pool. There is the question of the largest single private sector employer in Shorts in Belfast and how that will be affected. That's up for sale. In relation to workers' rights, I mean, one of the things that we said in Northern Ireland is the platform of workers' rights that are there were not handed out through the generosity of nation-state governments. Most of them were there through the European Union. For example, the transfer of undertakings legislation, the Organisation of Work and Time Act, or equality legislation, and you know that is a given. In relation to a plan B, I mean, it may be hard to say this, but we have to prepare for the worst, because there's very few precedents for this, and the only one I can think of is during the emergency, where we trusted on the goodwill of our neighbours in Britain, and a person who is a namesake of your own, who was the Secretary of the Department of Supplies, Mr. Chairman, maybe trusted excessively in our neighbours in Britain. He was, but you mightn't have thought that when we had no coal and no tea and no rubber and no petrol.
Economic war.
So sometimes you have to say that it won't always turn out for the best, and we have to make those plans. To go back to the other thing I said, though, in relation to forming alliances for the future, this is a new phase in Irish foreign policy. This is probably the biggest wrench that was taken since we decided sometime in the mid-50s, right, we're going into the EEC. And there are big challenges there. And in fairness, I have to say, the work of the Department of Foreign Affairs has seen us very, very well. They have proved their worth. Looking as an outsider, there seems to have been a downgrading of the status of the department up to the time of Brexit. And then they were rapidly ramped up again. And they've done us proud to get us into the situation. The one worry I would have is that there's an understanding for our situation in Brussels, but there's a growing sense of tiredness with Britain, almost like, people are saying, are you still here? And if you go to events in mainland Europe, sometimes, a lot of the time now, they're talking about other things, and that's a worry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and the Deputy Durkan and Senator Coghlan for your comments and questions. Maybe just to take some of them, just in relation to the makeup of the European Union and the challenges that the European Union will have in the future, Deputy Durkan. I think one of the things we took some encouragement from was the results of the European parliamentary elections, which have resulted in a more fragmented European Parliament, but not a dramatic swing either to the far right or the far left indeed. So even though the European People's Party, of which Fine Gael are members, has lost an overall majority in the Parliament, they're still the largest bloc in the Parliament, EPP. The S&D also have significant seats in the Parliament, and this new group that it's now called Renew Europe, which President Macron's En Marche party are part of, are also a significant bloc within the European Parliament, as are indeed the Greens, which made significant gains here in Ireland with 2 MEPs elected, and also in other member states. So we're encouraged by the fact that that fear of a big swing to nationalism or pro-nationalism of the past has not really materialised, and the results are encouraging in that regard. And I think it's something that we can all work towards ensuring a good next 5 years for the European Union and their institutions. On the issue which you raised, Senator Coghlan, about the high-tech industry, and there are clearly challenges for Ireland. And we have to face up to those particular challenges. And the world is actually changing and developing. There's a lot of focus on the new industries and how they will be taxed in the future. And it's always been IBEC's position that unilateral action by member states of the European Union should not be tolerated, and that the right way to do this would be to have an international tax agreement between all the players involved, and the place to do that is at the OECD. And IBEC has been participating very significantly in the work at the OECD through our affiliation with business at the OECD on those international tax questions. And the second wave of new international tax rules are now being worked on. We expect that they will be published progress will be made in 2020. And we've been saying to the European Union, both to the Commission and our business partners in different member states, that we should all act together on this rather than piecemeal unilateral moves, which
will lead to a suboptimum outcome for everybody. So we're deeply involved in that work. In fact, the Director General of Business at the OECD was in Ireland yesterday for the International Energy Conference, and I met him on Monday night, and he was in IBEC yesterday, and we talked more about this particular important element of the work at the OECD on international tax rules. Of course, we also need to ensure that we have the right skill sets here in Ireland to make sure that these companies find it attractive to remain here, that regardless of what happens in the international tax scene. And a key part of that is having the right skills. And this is where we would be 100% supportive of increased investment in third-level education in Ireland and the universities, and we have been working with Jim Miley and his team on that in IBEC to raise awareness that we need to actually invest in our universities and in that infrastructure here in Ireland, as we do in other elements of the education system as well. And infrastructure investment, also we have a campaign on infrastructure investment. I'll pass over to Arnold to say a word about that. On the issue of the border, the single market, yes, it cannot be compromised, and this is one of the things that we have worked with our European business partners on. We were very happy to see the German business group over the weekend on the 3rd anniversary of Brexit to come out and publicly state that they still fully supported the withdrawal agreement. The chief executive of our counterparts in Germany fully supported the withdrawal agreement and the backstop and the need to ensure that the single market is not compromised. Of course, that then gives us not only support but also responsibility that we as Ireland have to ensure that we play our part in that European protection of the single market. Of course, the backstop is much more than about the single market. It's also about the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process. We had a meeting this morning in IBEC with Minister for European Affairs, Helen McEntee, and one of the things we were very encouraged by was her answering of one of the questions from one of our members, and that is that the funding for the peace programme is going to be extended, and that's really welcomed. And so that peace on the island of Ireland is vitally important, not only to citizens and people, but also to business. And not only to business who do business with the UK, but for all the business here in Ireland, is that peace that has been achieved and the importance of the Good Friday Agreement in that regard. Our position in relation to the border is clear, and that is that we feel that the withdrawal agreement should be accepted. It should be brought through, and that there should be a transition period. If we get to a no-deal outcome, then I think we need to look at that area again, and we need to look at, in particular, a transition that business will need, because we don't believe that the authorities or business or state agencies in Ireland or across Europe will be fully prepared for the catastrophic impact of a no-deal exit. So that's our position, and we're sticking to that. We did meet with Make UK, the largest manufacturing representative body in the UK. They used to be the Engineering Enterprise Federation. Yesterday we had a meeting with them in IBEC. We talked about the challenges that their members are facing, very, very significant challenges. We're working with them to try to make sure that we can help them as much as possible, and also because our membership has such a deep integration and involvement in the UK market and in UK manufacturing for our sectors like food and drink and also in the farm and medtech area as well. I'll maybe come back to the relationship with the US, but maybe I'll just hand over to Arnold, and he might say a bit about the campaigns and funding that's been put into those.
Thank you, Chair. And I suppose just to pick up on that question about funding, and I suppose is the activity that we're involved in fully recognised by our members? I think the answer to that is an emphatic yes, that absolutely Irish business and our membership base is incredibly plugged in to the risks associated with Brexit. Was from the moment that even a referendum was mooted in the UK, long before even the referendum took place. So It's something that obviously that IBEC has sought to reflect over the course of our work over the last couple of years. Because of that support and recognition in our membership base, it has meant that we've been in a position to significantly resource that sort of work and reorientate our activity accordingly. IBEC has 4 active headline policy campaigns. 2 of them are focused on the domestic agenda around the future of work and the quality of life agenda, but half of those policy priorities, 2 of the campaigns are focused firstly on Brexit and the future of the EU, and the second one on our international reputation. So I think it's absolutely true that Irish business is incredibly aware as a small open economy and as open-minded business community of the risks that are out there, and I think has certainly mandated IBEC as our representative organisation to reflect that in our work accordingly.
Thank you very much. That's, Jim, sorry, Mr. Mealy, you might come back to.
Thank you, Chairman. Firstly, good to hear the feedback from your recent COSAC meeting, and I think it reflects very much the sentiment that we're hearing from our European colleagues in meetings with them. To address a couple of the questions, and I'll hand to my colleague to pick up on a couple of the others, because he's best placed to do so. Just on Senator Craughwell's question around the information economy and the need for an increased emphasis on apprenticeships, we wholeheartedly agree with that approach. We very much welcome the initiative taken by government on apprenticeships over the last 1 to 2 years. We think there's a lot more to be done, but we would broaden it beyond apprenticeships. And I would put it very much into work placement and collaboration with industry and enterprise, which is something that I think we very much share an agenda with IBEC on that. In that regard, the Human Capital Initiative, which was announced by the government in last year's budget, and which the first tranche of which will be allocated in next year's budget, is €300 million over 5 years, 60 million in each year starting from 2020. We've been in discussions with the Department of Education and Skills about that, and the emphasis that we have placed is that fund it shouldn't be just about numbers of placements or apprenticeships or of students, but that also it is used to bring about change, system change in third level, particularly in relation to innovation in how we as third level providers can innovate in the delivery of our courses, and can also have greater agility in terms of how we engage with enterprise. And I think there are some ideas that we have shared with Department of Education on that. And we would hope that HCI fund would be structured in a way that allows us to work together to progress that agenda. So we're very much in agreement with your view on that. The issues on the recognition of qualifications and progression, I'll leave to my colleague in a moment. Just to address the other issue you raised in relation to the funding and the push by certain forces in the EU to have a greater proportion of Erasmus funding borne by domestic governments. We would be in agreement that should be strongly resisted. Erasmus is a European fund. It has been very successful and it should remain so. And I think any moves in that direction, we'd certainly see it needs to be resisted, and we would hope that can be carried across European interests. However, I'd reflect back to my point earlier about overall funding for the system, and I think. Perhaps it's described here, and maybe I described it as investment in universities or in third level, but actually that isn't what this is about. This is about investing in our future. One of our current government ministers, I think, has referred to our people, our young people, as our oil reserve. Perhaps in these green days, talking about oil reserves has become a somewhat dirty word. But I do think it's an interesting metaphor, because oil reserves aren't a whole lot of use unless you invest quite a lot of money in harnessing them and in bringing them to the surface and in using them for the benefit of the economy. And, we don't have natural resources in Ireland compared with almost any of our European competitors. and our economy is largely now built on that oil reserve of our people. And the only way we can keep our competitive edge on that is if we invest in those people to harness that reserve for the future. And so this isn't about, campuses and universities and lecturers and courses. It's actually about the future of our economy. And we would say that, while European funds can carry us so far, some of those European funds, and particularly this is relevant to the research funding. So if there is more money for Horizon Europe, that 2021 to 2027 programme, which it looks like there is, our capacity to compete for that money is only as good as how much we invest ourselves, because it is a matching funding equation, and it is really important that we invest more in that. Lewis.
Thank you. I just pick up, if I may, Chair, on a couple of those issues as requested. Ireland is actually seen as a very good example across Europe in terms of the recognition of academic qualifications. Students who move around, as you correctly identified, in other countries do face challenges when they return home, having been abroad for a semester or a year, and then recognition of their modules or whatever they bring back with them. That is not the case for Irish higher education institutions. We have good systems in place, but even more importantly, we have very good systems for recognising foreign qualifications when people come to Ireland, either for the purposes of work or for the purposes of further study, and we are an attractive destination, as Senator noted, for both of those. QQI, our Qualifications and Quality Assurance Agency here in the National Agency, maintains an excellent database of foreign qualifications and what those qualifications translate to on the Irish framework of qualifications and what they can be most readily compared to in terms of a qualification delivered by an Irish education institution, whether it's further or higher, university or IOT, etc. So that example in Europe is actually admired by many, many countries, and QQI are solicited very often to talk about it and how can we manage it. But the Senator is right in saying that we have a problem sometimes within our country in terms of transfer and progression from further education to higher education, particularly from further education into the university world. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because we have quotas in the universities, we have quotas set aside for further education applicants, and we have great trouble filling those quotas. And we are currently undertaking a very significant piece of work led by the IUA, but with all the universities, but in very close consultation with the SOLAS, the Further Education and Training Agency, and the Department of Education and Skills to try and remove a lot of the barriers that we've built up over the years, which make it too complicated and too bureaucratic for further education award holders to progress easily and transparently into the university sector in particular. So that's a piece of work that's underway. We expect to see the results of that in a couple of years' time, but in the meanwhile we still have unfilled places which we'd like to fill and which the process is very difficult. In terms of you also mentioned, Senator, the need for greater flexibility in terms of delivery and reskilling and upskilling and the use of micro-credentials. And in specific, this is something that we have been asking the Department of Education to consider as part of the Human Capital Initiative. If we can achieve our goal of using that additional investment, and it really is new money coming in through the employer's contribution to the National Training Fund, so that we could deliver and leverage our existing higher education provision in much more flexible ways for people who need it, maybe in much smaller pieces, micro-credentials, more flexible learning, more part-time learning, etc. That would be a win-win for everybody involved. Deputy Durkan mentioned some of the challenges facing European democracy, and I think we have ample evidence, and you were in Romania for the last few days and you've seen the European support is the demographics around populism across Europe, whether it's from Romania to the United Kingdom, even to our own country, unfortunately. The demographics around that, a younger and in particular a more educated demographic is far more likely to be pro-European, to be engaged citizens, to be progressive in terms of democratic involvement, etc., etc. And this is one of the positive societal outcomes of investing in education as well at every level. And we see it here. We've seen the role that our young people have in driving economy, in driving innovation, in driving social change, in driving healthy societies. And that's why we do need to invest in this future for Ireland. We have significant support from our colleagues across Europe. One of the areas that you mentioned, Senator, in terms of a no-deal Brexit and the risks, there is, while we have sorted out, at least in the short to medium term, the mobility of staff and students across these islands, north, south, east, west, a disorderly Brexit would result in the UK crashing out of eligibility for European research funding. And they are currently the biggest players in that, and they're our biggest partners in terms of research outputs. But they're not only Ireland's biggest partners, they happen to be the biggest partners, the most important partners of many European countries, in particular smaller European countries. So that's an opportunity maybe for Ireland as a small country, but with a very active and developing research and innovation scene, both on the industry side and in the higher education side, to team up with some of these other countries who are looking for new partners too. And maybe we've made a few suggestions in our written submission to you about countries that we would see as useful and where we would like to strengthen those links in the future, and they're in the submission, and we'd be very happy to work with you if you have receiving delegations from there or you're visiting and you'd like us to brief you in advance and whatever you think would be useful.
No, I think I'll thank you all for coming. I think we have a very good exchange, and I want to thank you for your time and effort and energy, and continue your excellent work, because this is a Team Ireland initiative. We're in this together, every one of us. So, but I know that you're doing your utmost, and the context you have in Brussels, which will continue after Brexit, and your context, particularly in the United Kingdom, which are vitally important, because we have to work together in the future. So, thank you very much for coming, and we'll close this public session now. We'll go into private session in a few minutes. Thank you.